Christmas Eve in Maplewood, Connecticut had always been magical in our family. The snow fell gently on our suburban street, covering the perfectly manicured lawns that made our neighborhood the envy of Fairfield County. My name is Sarah, and at 24, I thought I understood family dynamics pretty well. I worked as a shift supervisor at Target, lived in my own apartment, and considered myself independent and mature. Boy, was I wrong. The trouble didn't start at Christmas dinner itself. That went surprisingly well, considering. It started 3 days later when my phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. on December 28th with a text from my dad, Michael. "Sarah, honey, can you come over after work? We got some kind of legal notice from the homeowners association. Something about our property." I stared at the message while sipping my morning coffee, my stomach already forming knots. Dad had lived in Pine Ridge Estates for 8 years. They'd never had a single issue with the HOA. But then again, my Aunt Victoria had just been elected to the HOA board 3 months ago. Victoria Mitchell, my mom's sister and the woman who had turned our Christmas celebration into an interrogation about my life choices. The memory was still fresh. Victoria sitting at the head of our dinner table like she owned the place, making snide comments about my retail job, my small apartment, my single status at 24. "Sarah, dear," she'd said in that syrupy voice that made my skin crawl, "when I was your age, I was already married to Robert and building our real estate empire. Don't you think it's time you aimed higher?" I'd defended myself, maybe a bit too passionately. Pointed out that I was putting myself through community college, that retail management was actually teaching me valuable skills, that not everyone needed to follow her path. The conversation had gotten heated when she'd started criticizing my 16-year-old cousin Lily for wanting to go to art school instead of business school. Art school? Victoria had laughed, that cold, cutting sound that always made me want to hide. "That's not a career. That's an expensive hobby. Lily needs to think practically about her future, not chase fairy tales." Lily had started crying, and I'd lost it. Called Victoria out for crushing a teenager's dreams, for making everything about money and status. The dinner had ended with Victoria storming out, but not before promising that our family would learn some respect. At the time, I thought it was just typical Victoria dramatics. She was always threatening consequences whenever anyone disagreed with her. But as I drove to my parents' house in Maplewood after my shift that evening, I had a sinking feeling that this HOA notice wasn't a coincidence. Dad met me at the door, looking older than his 52 years. His hair, prematurely gray from stress, and his recent diagnosis with type 2 diabetes, looked disheveled. Mom stood behind him, wringing her hands, a nervous habit she'd developed since Dad's health scare 6 months ago. "Show me the notice," I said, not bothering with pleasantries. Dad handed me a crisp white envelope, officially sealed with the Pine Ridge Estates logo. Inside was a violation notice, typed on official letterhead and signed at the bottom with Victoria's flowing signature. Violation notice property, 42 Maple Lane, Maplewood, CT. Violation. Lawn height exceeds community standards. 2.5 inches measured, 2-inch maximum required. Fine, $250 correction. Deadline, January the 2nd. Board member, Victoria Mitchell, Architectural Review Committee Chair. I looked up at my parents, then out at their front yard. Even in December, their lawn was immaculate, Dad's pride and joy. He'd been meticulous about yard care for years, especially since retirement had given him more time to focus on it. Dad, when did you last cut the grass?" "November 15th before the first freeze," he said, pulling on his coat. "Come on, let's measure it." We trudged out into the cold, Dad carrying a ruler while I used my phone's flashlight. The grass was dormant, brown and thin from winter. When Dad knelt down and measured multiple spots, every reading came back at exactly 2 inches. "This is impossible," I muttered, taking photos with my phone. "It's exactly 2 inches, just like the rules state." Mom appeared on the porch, shivering in her robe. "Victoria's been driving through the neighborhood every evening since Christmas," she called out. Mrs. Henderson next door mentioned it, said Victoria was stopping and taking pictures of houses. My blood ran cold. "Taking pictures? Of which houses?" Well, ours, obviously, but also the Johnsons' place. You know, where Jake rents that basement apartment, and your cousin Emma's family over on Oak Street. The pattern was immediately obvious, and it made me furious. Victoria wasn't randomly enforcing HOA rules. She was targeting every family member who had supported me during the Christmas dinner confrontation. I spent that night researching Pine Ridge Estate's HOA bylaws, a 47-page document that I'd never bothered to read before. What I found was both fascinating and terrifying. Victoria, as the new chair of the Architectural Review Committee, had broad authority to issue violations and fines. The bylaws were incredibly detailed and incredibly subjective. Property maintenance standards included lawn height, maximum 2 inches, mailbox specifications, black in good repair, appropriate style, trash receptacle visibility, not visible from street for more than 30 minutes on collection day, seasonal decorations, removed within 48 hours of holiday conclusion, driveway condition, free from stains, cracks, or discoloration, window treatments, harmonious with neighborhood aesthetic. The language was vague enough that almost any property could be cited for violations if someone was determined enough, and the fines, they escalated quickly. First offense, $250, second offense, $500, third offense, $1,000. Additional offenses could result in liens against the property. I was still reading when my phone buzzed with a text from Emma, my cousin who lived 3 streets over. "Sarah, did your parents get an HOA notice too? We got one about our mailbox being the wrong shade of black. This is insane." Then another text from Jake. "Dude, my landlord just got a violation notice about the oil stain on our driveway. It's been there for 2 years and nobody cared until now." I stayed up until 3 a.m. creating a spreadsheet to track what I already suspected would become a pattern. 3 properties, 3 family members who had defended me, 3 sudden violations from Victoria. The war had officially begun. By New Year's Day, the picture had become crystal clear. Victoria wasn't just abusing her HOA position, she was conducting a systematic campaign of harassment against our entire family. My parents received 4 more violation notices between December 29th and January 1st. December 30th, Christmas lights still displayed, 1 day past the 48-hour deadline, $500 fine. December 31st, trash receptacles visible from street for 45 minutes instead of allowed 30 minutes, $750 fine. January 1st, driveway shows minor oil stains from holiday guest parking, $500 fine. January 1st, second notice. Garden gnome facing wrong direction, creating visual discord, $250 fine. The garden gnome violation was particularly absurd. Dad had placed that cheerful little statue by their front steps 3 years ago, and it had been facing the same direction ever since. But according to Victoria's violation notice, garden decorations must face toward the house to maintain neighborhood harmony. So that's $2,250 in 5 days, Mom said, spreading the notices across their kitchen table. Her hands shook as she organized them chronologically. "Sarah, we can't afford this. Not with your father's medical bills and my reduced hours at work." My mother, Linda, worked as the administrative coordinator at Riverside Elementary School in town. She'd been there for 14 years and had never had a single complaint. But suddenly, parents started approaching her with questions. "Mrs. Thompson cornered me in the parking lot yesterday," Mom told me over coffee on January 3rd. "Said she heard that you were fired from Target for stealing merchandise. Asked if I thought it was appropriate for someone with a thief in the family to have access to student records." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Mom, I've never stolen anything in my life. I got promoted to shift supervisor last month." "I know that, sweetheart, but 3 different parents have asked me about it now." Mrs. Chen said Victoria brought it up at the school board meeting, said she was concerned about the moral character of families represented in our school system. The scope of Victoria's campaign was becoming clear. She wasn't just targeting our property with HOA violations. She was attacking our reputations, our jobs, our standing in the community. and she was using her extensive network of connections to do it. Victoria and her husband Robert owned Mitchell & Associates Realty, the most successful real estate firm in Fairfield County. They were active in local politics, charitable organizations, and social clubs. Victoria served on the boards of 3 different nonprofits. She was a regular attendee at city council meetings. She knew everyone who mattered in our small suburban community, and she was using every single connection to destroy us. My best friend Marcus lived in a studio apartment in one of Robert's rental properties downtown. On January 5th, he got an eviction notice claiming he owed 3 months of back rent. "Sarah, this is insane," Marcus said, showing me his bank records on his laptop. "I've got proof of every single payment. I've never been late, never missed one, but when I try to call the property management company, they won't take my calls." Marcus had been an unwavering supporter during Christmas dinner. When Victoria had criticized my job and life choices, he jumped to my defense, pointing out that I was working hard and going to school. He'd also defended Lily's artistic ambitions, sharing stories about successful artists he knew from college. The eviction notice gave him 10 days to vacate or face legal action. Despite having 2 years of rent receipts, canceled checks, and bank statements proving his payments, the property management company insisted their records showed otherwise. That weekend, I drove to my cousin Emma's house to check on her family. Emma was my age, a nurse at Hartford Hospital, married with 2 young kids. Her husband, Carlos, worked as a mechanic at the local Ford dealership. They were good, hard-working people who'd never had any trouble with anyone. "It's getting worse," Emma told me, bouncing her 3-year-old daughter on her lap while 5-year-old son played nearby. "We've gotten 8 HOA violations since Christmas. The mailbox paint, a garden hose that was improperly stored, our Halloween decorations being stored visibly in the garage, our trash can being dented. It's costing us over $3,000. Carlos looked exhausted. "I've been spending every evening after work trying to fix things that aren't actually broken, repainting the mailbox, buying new trash cans, reorganizing the garage, and it doesn't matter, she finds new problems every day." "Has it affected work?" I asked. Emma and Carlos exchanged a look that told me everything. "The hospital administrator called me in yesterday," Emma said quietly, "said they'd received some concerning information about my family situation. Apparently, Victoria knows someone on the board of directors. They're not firing me, but they're reviewing my position." This was how Victoria operated. She didn't attack directly. She was too smart for that. Instead, she used her web of connections to apply pressure from multiple angles, make life so difficult, so stressful, so financially devastating that her targets would have no choice but to surrender. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how stubborn our family could be when pushed too far, and she'd especially underestimated my capacity for documentation and strategic thinking. On January 8th, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to fight back, but I was going to do it smart. I was going to document every single thing Victoria did, build an ironclad case against her, and expose her abuse of power to everyone who mattered. I started with a simple Excel spreadsheet tracking every violation notice, every fine, every incident. But as the pattern became clearer, my documentation system grew more sophisticated. By mid-January, my documentation project had expanded into something that would make a private investigator proud. I'd created multiple spreadsheets tracking different aspects of Victoria's campaign. HOA violations tracker, date of violation notice, T. Property address, type of violation, fine amount, photos proving compliance with actual bylaws, whether violation was legitimate or manufactured, family impact assessment, employment retaliation incidents, social, community harassment, financial costs, health impacts, dad's stress-related blood pressure spikes, timeline correlations with Christmas dinner, Victoria's network map. First Master I. Her business connections, board positions and volunteer roles, social relationships. Dikrar Sain. Potential conflicts of interest. What I discovered was both impressive and terrifying. Victoria had built a web of influence that touched almost every aspect of our small suburban community. She wasn't just randomly powerful, she was strategically connected. Through her real estate business, she had relationships with 3 city council members, clients who'd bought houses through her firm. The superintendent of the school district sold him his current home, Benashurus Biscornsansansir, 2 county judges active in the same charity organization, the police chief, neighbor and golf partner, half the local business owners, either clients or business referral partners. But Victoria's most dangerous weapon wasn't her connections. It was her ability to manipulate information and create believable narratives. She was a master at taking small truths and twisting them into larger lies. For example, the story about me being fired for theft from Target. Here's what actually happened. 2 months ago, there had been an inventory discrepancy in my department. Standard procedure was to investigate all employees who had access to that merchandise. I was questioned along with 8 other people and quickly cleared when security footage proved I had nothing to do with it. The real thief was caught a week later. But Victoria had somehow learned about the initial investigation and transformed it into Sarah was investigated for theft, to Sarah was suspected of stealing, to Sarah was fired for stealing. By the time the story reached the school where my mother worked, it had become fact in people's minds. This is how skilled manipulators operate. They don't create lies out of whole cloth. They take real events and twist them just enough to serve their purposes while maintaining plausible deniability. On January 15th, things escalated dramatically. My 16-year-old cousin Lily called me in tears. "Sarah, something's happening at school. Kids are saying my mom is embezzling money from the PTA. They're saying we might have to move because of some scandal. What's going on?" Lily's mom, my Aunt Jennifer, was Victoria's sister-in-law and had been treasurer of Lily's school PTA for 3 years. She was meticulous about finances and had never had a single issue. But suddenly there were questions about the accounts. I drove to Jennifer's house immediately. She met me at the door, her eyes red from crying. "Sarah, I don't understand what's happening. The PTA president called an emergency meeting, said there were concerns about missing funds. I've got every receipt, every bank statement, everything perfectly documented, but somehow the numbers aren't adding up according to their review." Jennifer showed me her records. 3 years of impeccable financial documentation, every transaction recorded, every receipt filed, every bank statement balanced to the penny. Who's conducting the review?" I asked. "Some external accounting firm. The president said it was recommended by a board member who had concerns about financial transparency." My stomach dropped. "Which board member?" "Victoria Mitchell. She said as a real estate professional she felt obligated to suggest proper financial oversight." The pattern was clear. Victoria was using her position and reputation to raise concerns about family members, forcing investigations that would create gossip and suspicion, even if they ultimately proved nothing wrong. The damage was in the accusation, not the conclusion. But this attack on Jennifer was different from the others. It involved a minor, Lily, and that made me furious in a way I hadn't felt before. I decided it was time to take a more aggressive approach to my documentation. Up until now, I'd been collecting evidence reactively, documenting Victoria's attacks after they happened, but I realized I needed to start gathering evidence proactively. Connecticut is a one-party consent state for recording conversations, which meant I could legally record any conversation I was part of without the other person's knowledge. I bought a high-quality digital voice recorder and started carrying it everywhere. I also began what I called systematic observation. Every evening after work, I drove through Victoria's neighborhood and our family's properties, taking photos and making notes. I documented the condition of various lawns, mailboxes, driveways, and other property features throughout Pine Ridge Estates. What I discovered was shocking. Victoria was conducting wildly selective enforcement of HOA rules. Properties owned by her friends and allies had violations just as egregious as the ones she was citing our family for, but they received no notices. Meanwhile, she was issuing violations to our family properties for things that weren't actually rule violations at all. For example, the garden gnome facing wrong direction violation. I found 23 other garden decorations in the neighborhood facing the same direction as my parents' gnome. None of them had received violations. The trash can visibility violations were even more selective. I sat in my car for 3 hours on trash day, timing exactly how long various residents left their cans visible from the street. 12 households left cans out for more than the supposed 30-minute limit. Only family members received violations. This selective enforcement wasn't just unfair, it was potentially illegal. HOA boards have a legal obligation to enforce rules consistently and fairly. Victoria was clearly violating that obligation. But I needed more than documentation of HOA abuse. I needed evidence of the broader campaign of harassment, and that meant I needed to get Victoria on tape. Lily's 17th birthday party was scheduled for February 10th. Despite everything that had happened, Jennifer decided to proceed with the celebration. "I won't let Victoria steal my daughter's special day," she said with a determination I'd rarely seen from my normally mild-mannered aunt. I knew Victoria would attend. She never missed family events, not because she cared about family, but because they provided opportunities to gather information and maintain her image as the family matriarch. This would be my chance to record her in action. I arrived early to help Jennifer set up, my voice recorder discreetly placed in my jacket pocket. Other family members filtered in throughout the afternoon, the tension palpable. Everyone knew about the HOA violations, the job harassment, the PTA investigation, but nobody knew how to address it directly. Victoria arrived at 2 p.m. sharp with Robert, carrying an expensive gift bag and wearing the practiced smile she used for public appearances. She made her rounds, hugging family members, complimenting Jennifer on the decorations, acting like the perfect aunt. But I was watching closely, and I could see the calculation behind her actions. She positioned herself strategically to overhear conversations. She asked seemingly innocent questions designed to gather information about people's employment, finances, and personal situations. The breakthrough moment came when Lily opened her gifts. Victoria had bought her an expensive art supply set. Easel, professional paints, brushes, the works. It looked generous, but I recognized it as another manipulation tactic. "Oh, Victoria, this is too much," Jennifer said, clearly uncomfortable with the expensive gift given everything else that was happening. "Nonsense," Victoria replied loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "I want to support Lily's artistic hobbies. Of course, I still think she should consider practical career options for college, but there's nothing wrong with creative pursuits as a pastime." The word hobbies was delivered with just enough condescension to be cutting, but subtle enough that calling it out would make you seem oversensitive. It was classic Victoria, the insult disguised as generosity. Lily looked hurt, but tried to hide it. "Thank you, Aunt Victoria. I really do plan to pursue art professionally, though." "Oh, sweetheart," Victoria said, reaching over to pat Lily's hand in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt patronizing. "You're young. You'll understand better when you're older how important financial stability is. Ask Sarah. She's learning that lesson the hard way right now." The room went quiet. This was the opening Victoria had been building toward all afternoon, a chance to publicly humiliate me while appearing to offer wisdom. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I'm doing quite well. I got promoted to shift supervisor last month, and I'm on track to transfer to management training." "Of course, dear," Victoria smiled, but her eyes were cold. "Though I did hear there were some concerns about your performance recently. Something about inventory issues?" There it was. Victoria was publicly repeating the twisted version of the theft investigation story, counting on the fact that most family members didn't know the real details. "Those concerns were investigated and resolved," I replied firmly. "I was completely cleared of any wrongdoing." "Well, I'm sure you were," Victoria said, her tone suggesting exactly the opposite, "though it's unfortunate that these sorts of questions can affect how people perceive you professionally. Reputation is so important in a small community like ours." The threat was clear but veiled. Victoria was reminding everyone that she had the power to spread damaging stories about us throughout the community, while maintaining plausible deniability about her role in doing so. Uncle Robert, who had been mostly quiet during the exchange, suddenly spoke up. Victoria's right about reputation being important. It's interesting how quickly stories spread in this town. Sometimes rumors get started by people with their own agendas. I looked at Robert with surprise. Was he actually pushing back against Victoria? Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, Robert. Though I've always found that where there's smoke, there's usually fire. People don't generally make up stories about others for no reason. Sometimes they do, said a quiet voice from across the room. It was my grandmother, Eleanor, 84 years old and sharp as ever. Sometimes people create problems where none existed before. The room fell completely silent. Grandma Eleanor was the family matriarch, the person everyone respected and listened to. If she was taking sides in this conflict, it was significant. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something ugly flash across her face before she recovered her composure. Well, Victoria said, standing up and smoothing her skirt, I think we should focus on celebrating Lily today. Family gatherings should be about joy, not unpleasantness. The word unpleasantness hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria was positioning herself as the reasonable one, the one trying to maintain family harmony, while implying that anyone who disagreed with her was causing drama. But she'd made a mistake. In trying to humiliate me, she'd shown everyone exactly who she really was, and I'd recorded every word. That evening, I listened to the recording multiple times, transcribing key quotes and noting the timing of each exchange. Victoria had revealed her tactics clearly. Public humiliation disguised as concern, spreading twisted versions of private information, threatening consequences while maintaining deniability, positioning herself as reasonable while painting targets as problematic, using family gatherings to gather intelligence and apply social pressure. But the recording had also revealed something else. Cracks in Victoria's support system, Robert's subtle pushback, Grandma Eleanor's direct challenge, other family members' uncomfortable silence when Victoria made her attacks. Victoria wasn't as untouchable as she wanted us to believe, and I was going to use that knowledge against her. 3 days after Lily's party, Grandma Eleanor called me with a trembling voice. Sarah, honey, can you come over? Something strange is happening with my bank account. I drove to Grandma's house immediately, my stomach tight with worry. Eleanor lived independently in the same house she'd owned for 40 years, managing her own finances with the help of a bookkeeper who came twice a month. She was sharp, organized, and careful with money. I went to pay my property taxes yesterday, she explained, showing me a bank statement. I had $4,200 in my checking account last month, but when I tried to write the check, the bank said I only had $347. My blood ran cold. Grandma, do you have your statements from the last few months? We spread 3 months of bank statements across her kitchen table, and the pattern was immediately obvious and terrifying. Regular withdrawals, always just under $2,000, always on different days of the week, always done at different bank branches throughout the county. Someone had been systematically draining Grandma's account for 3 months, $18,000 total. Who has access to your account, Grandma? Nance. Just me, she said slowly. And Victoria. She has my power of attorney for financial matters. I gave it to her 2 years ago when I had that minor stroke and needed help managing things temporarily. The power of attorney. I'd forgotten about that. After Grandma's stroke, Victoria had positioned herself as the responsible family member who would help manage Eleanor's affairs. At the time, it had seemed generous and practical. Now I realized it had been a setup. Grandma, do you remember making these withdrawals? Eleanor studied the statements carefully, her face growing pale. No, I don't remember any of these. And look at the locations. Hartford, Waterbury, Bridgeport. I never drive to those places anymore. I helped Grandma gather every financial document she had: bank statements, receipts, check registers, investment account information. What we discovered was a sophisticated theft operation. Victoria had been using the power of attorney to make withdrawals from multiple accounts. Not just checking, but savings and a small investment account too. She'd been careful to vary the amounts, timing, and locations to avoid triggering bank fraud detection systems. But she'd also been creating fraudulent documentation, receipts for home repairs, medical equipment, and services that had never been provided, all of them signed with a shaky signature that looked similar to Grandma's handwriting if you weren't looking closely. When we confronted Victoria the next day at her real estate office, she was prepared with a performance that would have impressed Hollywood. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, rushing around her desk to hug Grandma with theatrical concern. "I was just about to call you. I've been so worried about your memory lately." Victoria produced a folder thick with receipts and documentation. These are all the expenses I've been helping you with," she explained, spreading papers across her conference table. "The new stair railings for safety, the medical alert system, the grocery delivery service. You signed off on all of these, remember?" The signatures looked authentic at first glance, but when I examined them closely, I could see they were too consistent, too practiced. Real signatures from an 84-year-old woman would vary more, especially someone who'd had a stroke. "I don't remember signing these," Grandma said quietly. "Of course you don't, dear," Victoria said, her voice dripping with condescending sympathy. "That's exactly what I've been worried about. Your memory has been getting worse. Yesterday you called me asking about your newspaper delivery 3 times. Last week you forgot that you'd already paid your electric bill and tried to pay it again." This was another of Victoria's tactics: gaslighting, taking normal senior moments that everyone has and turning them into evidence of incompetence, making Grandma doubt her own memory and perception. "Dr. Peterson mentioned he was concerned about early-stage dementia at your last appointment," Victoria continued. "That's why I've been helping you manage your finances more closely, to protect you from making mistakes." I knew this was a lie. Grandma's doctor had never mentioned dementia concerns. I'd driven her to her last 3 appointments, but Victoria was counting on the fact that most people assume medical privacy rules would prevent me from knowing about such a diagnosis. "I'd like to review the receipts for these expenses," I said, reaching for the folder. "Of course," Victoria smiled, "though I'm not sure why you're questioning legitimate medical and safety expenses, unless you have some reason to doubt my care for our grandmother." The question was loaded with implication. Victoria was positioning me as the unreasonable one, the suspicious family member questioning necessary care for an elderly woman. But I'd been expecting this. I pulled out my phone and showed Victoria photos I'd taken of Grandma's house. "These are the stair railings you supposedly installed," I said, swiping through images. "They're the same railings that were there 2 years ago. And this medical alert system? Grandma's never had one installed." Victoria's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "The company may have delayed installation. These things take time to coordinate." "For 3 months? And what about the grocery delivery service? Grandma drives herself to the store every Tuesday and Friday, same as she has for years." "Sarah, I understand you're concerned," Victoria said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "But perhaps this is above your understanding. Financial management for seniors involves complex considerations." There it was again, the implication that I was too young, too inexperienced, too ignorant to understand adult responsibilities. But this time, I was ready. "You're right that it's complex," I said, pulling out a notebook. "That's why I've done some research on elder financial abuse laws in Connecticut. Did you know that misusing power of attorney is a felony? The penalties include up to 10 years in prison and restitution of 3 times the amount stolen. Gansar samadatra and undershar some are tierno." The room went completely quiet. Victoria's mask of concern finally slipped, and for a moment I saw cold fury in her eyes before she regained control. "How dare you accuse me of theft?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "After everything I've done for this family." "I'm not accusing you of anything," I replied calmly. "I'm simply suggesting that we need to do a thorough review of all financial transactions. If everything is legitimate, then there's nothing to worry about." Victoria stood up abruptly. "This conversation is over. Eleanor, I think it's clear that Sarah is having some kind of breakdown, making wild accusations against family members who are trying to help. Perhaps it's time to limit her access to your financial information. The threat was clear. Victoria was suggesting that Grandma's mental capacity was in question, and that I was the unstable one who needed to be controlled. But Grandma Eleanor surprised everyone by standing up with dignity and purpose. "Victoria," she said in a voice that brooked no argument, "I want copies of every document you just showed me. I want a complete accounting of every transaction, and I want my power of attorney paperwork reviewed by an independent attorney." Victoria's face went pale. "Eleanor, you're clearly confused. This is exactly the kind of poor decision-making I've been worried about." "My decision-making is fine," Grandma replied firmly. "What's confused is why my account is missing $18,000 and why you have receipts for services that were never provided." That's when Victoria made her biggest mistake. Instead of trying to maintain her facade of concern, she got angry. "Fine," she snapped. "Handle your own finances. See how well that goes when you can't remember what you had for breakfast. Don't come crying to me when you lose everything because you can't manage your own affairs." The mask was completely off now. The caring family member persona had been replaced by someone cold, calculating, and vindictive, and I was recording every word. That afternoon, Grandma and I went to the bank and filed a formal complaint about unauthorized withdrawals. We also went to the police station to file a report for elder financial abuse. The detective who took our report, a woman named Detective Martinez, was familiar with these types of cases. "Financial abuse of elderly family members is more common than people think," she explained. "The good news is that you've documented everything carefully. The bad news is that cases involving power of attorney can be complex to prosecute, especially when the accused has a good reputation in the community." What kind of evidence would make the case stronger?" I asked. "Proof of intent to defraud, evidence that the accused knew they were taking money for services not provided, documentation showing a pattern of deception rather than misunderstanding." I thought about my voice recordings, my HOA violation documentation, the systematic campaign against our family. Victoria hadn't just stolen money from Grandma, she'd been conducting a months-long revenge campaign that included multiple types of harassment and abuse of power. This wasn't a simple case of financial elder abuse. This was a complex criminal conspiracy involving mail fraud, the false HOA violations, workplace harassment, defamation, and elder abuse. And I was going to prove all of it. Building a criminal case against Victoria required expanding my investigation beyond just the financial theft. I needed to prove intent, pattern, and coordination across multiple types of harassment. I started by reaching out to other HOA members who might have experienced similar selective enforcement. What I discovered was that Victoria's abuse of her board position extended far beyond our family. Through careful networking and community meetings, I identified 7 other homeowners who had been targeted with questionable HOA violations. The pattern was always the same. People who had disagreed with Victoria at board meetings, questioned her decisions, or opposed her preferred contractors and vendors. Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher, had received 12 violations in 3 months after questioning why all landscaping contracts were going to Victoria's brother-in-law's company. Mr. Singh, an engineer, had been fined repeatedly for architectural inconsistencies after proposing a more cost-effective solution for community street lighting. Most significantly, I connected with Janet Williams, a local attorney who lived in Pine Ridge Estates and had been fighting her own battle against Victoria's selective enforcement. "I've been documenting her patterns for 6 months," Janet told me over coffee. "But as a single voice, it's hard to challenge someone with Victoria's connections. If we could build a coalition of affected homeowners..." Janet had legal expertise I lacked. She understood the procedural requirements for challenging HOA board decisions, the documentation standards for legal proceedings, and the regulatory agencies that oversee homeowner associations. Together, we began building what Janet called a comprehensive case for systemic abuse of authority. danakratsinser da sant koribond. Meanwhile, the investigation into Grandma's financial abuse was yielding results. The bank's fraud investigation had uncovered additional irregularities. Victoria had been using her power of attorney to make investment decisions that benefited her real estate business, steering Grandma's portfolio toward properties and funds that generated commissions for Mitchell & Associates Realty. Detective Martinez called me on March 15th with significant news. "We've found evidence that your aunt has been running a more extensive financial scheme," she explained. "She's been managing finances for 3 other elderly community members, all using powers of attorney obtained under questionable circumstances. The pattern was sophisticated and disturbing. Victoria would identify elderly community members who were socially isolated or dealing with health issues. She'd position herself as a helpful family friend or community member willing to assist with complex financial tasks. Once she gained their trust, she'd suggest that they needed power of attorney documentation just in case something happened. Then she'd begin systematically draining their accounts while creating fraudulent documentation to cover the thefts." "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. "Over $75,000 across 4 victims, including your grandmother." The scope was staggering. Victoria had been running a criminal enterprise that used her community connections and reputation to identify and exploit vulnerable elderly victims. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Victoria's network of enablers. Her husband Robert knew about the financial schemes and had been helping launder the stolen money through their real estate business. Victoria's son-in-law, who worked in regional management at Target, had been providing confidential employee information that Victoria used to orchestrate workplace harassment. Her daughter, who worked at the school district's central office, had been sharing private family information from student records. This wasn't just one person abusing power. It was a family criminal conspiracy that had been operating for over 2 years. The legal proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. Once Detective Martinez presented evidence of the broader financial scheme to the district attorney's office, they recognized this as a significant case that could impact community trust in local institutions. Victoria was arrested on April 2nd, charged with elder abuse, 4 counts, fraud, multiple counts, abuse of power of attorney, mail fraud related to the fake HOA violations, conspiracy involving her family members. The arrest made front-page news in our local paper. "Local realtor charged in elder abuse scheme" was the headline, along with Victoria's professional headshot and details about the charges. The community response was swift and dramatic. Clients began dropping Mitchell & Associates Realty. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Victoria from all positions. The nonprofit organizations where she served on boards quickly announced her resignation. Robert was charged as an accessory for his role in laundering the stolen money. Their son-in-law lost his job at Target for misusing confidential employee information. Their daughter faced disciplinary action from the school district. The house of cards Victoria had built through years of careful networking and manipulation collapsed in a matter of weeks. But the most satisfying moment came during the restitution hearing in June. Victoria's attorney tried to argue that the financial transactions were misunderstandings, that Victoria had genuinely believed she was helping elderly community members manage their affairs. That's when Judge Harrison asked to hear the voice recordings I'd made. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to Victoria's cold, calculated threats being played back through the sound system, her true character was impossible to deny. Her contemptuous dismissal of Grandma's concerns, her threats about poor decision-making, her anger when confronted with evidence of theft. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Harrison said after listening to several recordings, "these conversations reveal a clear intent to deceive and manipulate vulnerable elderly victims. This court finds that your actions constitute a deliberate criminal scheme, not a series of misunderstandings." Victoria was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 5 years probation, and ordered to pay full restitution to all victims plus additional penalties. The total amount was over $95,000. But the legal consequences were only part of her downfall. Victoria's social and professional reputation was completely destroyed. The woman who had spent decades building an image as a pillar of the community was now known as someone who exploited elderly victims for financial gain. pain. The year following Victoria's conviction was a time of healing and rebuilding for our family. The financial restitution helped stabilize everyone's situation, but the emotional recovery took longer. My parents' stress levels decreased dramatically once the constant HOA harassment ended. Dad's blood pressure improved so much that his doctor was able to reduce his medication. Mom flourished at work without the constant worry about her reputation being attacked. Marcus moved into a better apartment after the eviction charges against him were dropped, and he received compensation for the harassment. Emma and Carlos used part of their restitution money to take their kids on a vacation they'd been planning for years, but couldn't afford. Lily bloomed in ways that were beautiful to watch. Without Victoria's constant criticism and undermining, she gained confidence in her artistic abilities and her future plans. She was accepted to 3 different art schools and received a partial scholarship to her first-choice program. Grandma Eleanor became something of a local celebrity, speaking at senior centers and community groups about recognizing and preventing elder financial abuse. Her experience helped others identify similar schemes and protect themselves. The most important thing, she'd tell audiences, is to trust your instincts. If someone is pressuring you to make financial decisions quickly or making you doubt your own memory and judgment, those are warning signs. The HOA reforms that Janet Williams and I had pushed for were implemented throughout Pine Ridge Estates. New oversight procedures, appeals processes, and transparency requirements made it much harder for board members to abuse their authority. Most significantly, our family relationships had been transformed. The crisis had forced us to communicate more directly, support each other more intentionally, and recognize manipulation tactics that we'd previously overlooked or tolerated. We learned to have difficult conversations, set healthy boundaries, and prioritize authentic connection over maintaining false harmony. Victoria's attacks had been devastating, but they'd also revealed the strength and resilience that existed within our family when we worked together. The Victoria Mitchell case became a catalyst for broader changes in our community and beyond. Local news coverage of the financial abuse scheme prompted other victims to come forward, not just targets of Victoria's crimes, but elderly people who had experienced similar schemes by other perpetrators. The police department created a new elder abuse investigation unit. The county implemented additional oversight for power of attorney documentation. Financial institutions improved their monitoring systems for accounts managed by non-family members. My documentation methods became a model used by law enforcement and victim advocates. Detective Martinez invited me to speak at training seminars for investigators working on elder abuse cases. The key to Sarah's success, she would explain, was comprehensive documentation combined with strategic thinking. She didn't just collect evidence reactively. She anticipated Victoria's tactics and prepared accordingly. The strategies I developed became part of a resource guide distributed by the State Attorney General's office. The guide included templates for organizing evidence, tips for recording conversations legally, and instructions for building timeline documentation. My story was featured in a national magazine article about family financial abuse, and I began receiving messages from people across the country who had experienced similar situations. Many of them had felt isolated and helpless when facing manipulation from family members who held positions of trust and authority. "Your story gave me permission to fight back," one woman wrote. "I thought I was the only one dealing with this kind of systematic family abuse." The community organizing work that Janet Williams and I had done around HOA reform expanded into a broader advocacy effort. We helped draft model legislation for homeowner association oversight that was introduced in the state legislature. The bill included provisions for mandatory training for HOA board members, appeals processes for disputed violations, financial transparency requirements, penalties for selective enforcement of rules, regular audits of HOA finances and procedures. The legislation passed the following year and became a model for similar laws in other states. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on other families facing manipulation and abuse. My story had shown that even sophisticated, well-connected abusers could be held accountable if victims documented carefully and worked strategically. 2 years after Victoria's conviction, our family had built something stronger and healthier than what we'd had before the crisis. The trauma had forced us to examine our patterns of communication, our tolerance for manipulation, and our willingness to support each other through difficulties. We developed new traditions and ways of gathering that prioritized authentic connection over performed harmony. Family dinners became spaces for honest conversation rather than careful performances. We learned to have conflicts without allowing them to escalate into warfare. Lily graduated from high school with honors and started her freshman year at art school. Her confidence and artistic skills had flourished without Victoria's constant undermining. She began working on a series of paintings inspired by her experience with family manipulation and recovery. "I want to show how families can heal from trauma," she explained while working on a piece that depicted broken pottery being rebuilt with gold veins, how the cracks can become part of the beauty instead of something to hide. Marcus started his own small business, providing moving and home organization services. His experience with Victoria's eviction scheme had taught him about tenant rights and property management, knowledge he used to help other renters protect themselves from abusive landlords. Emma went back to school to become a nurse practitioner, using educational benefits from a victim compensation fund. She specialized in elder care, working with families to recognize signs of abuse and neglect. My parents began volunteering with a local organization that helped elderly community members with financial management and decision-making. They provided practical support while also serving as advocates to prevent exploitation. As for me, the experience had revealed skills and interests I didn't know I possessed. I discovered that I was good at investigation, documentation, and strategic thinking. I enjoyed helping people organize evidence and navigate complex systems. I left Target and enrolled in a criminal justice program at the local state university, with plans to work in fraud investigation or victim advocacy. The scholarship I received was funded by restitution money from Victoria's case, a perfect example of turning victimization into opportunity. Detective Martinez became a mentor, helping me understand the investigative process and connecting me with professionals in the field. She encouraged me to consider law enforcement as a career. "You have natural instincts for this work," she told me, "and your experience as a victim gives you perspective that's valuable in understanding how these crimes impact people's lives." I also began speaking at community groups and conferences about recognizing and documenting family manipulation and abuse. My presentations included practical tools like spreadsheet templates, recording apps, and resource lists. The most common question I received was, how do you know when someone is manipulating you versus just having a difficult personality? My answer evolved over time, but it centered on patterns of behavior. Manipulation involves systematic efforts to control or harm others. Manipulators create consequences for people who disagree with them. They use multiple tactics across different areas of life: work, family, finances, social relationships. They maintain plausible deniability while escalating pressure over time. They target multiple victims with similar patterns. Difficult people have conflicts, I would explain. Manipulators have campaigns. Victoria's case had taught me that sophisticated abusers often operate in ways that are initially hard to recognize. They build reputations and networks that provide cover for their actions. They exploit systems and institutions that are designed to protect people. But the case had also shown that even well-connected, strategic abusers make mistakes and leave evidence. With careful documentation, community support, and persistence, victims can build cases that expose the truth and create accountability. 3 years post-conviction, Victoria's impact on our community continued to reverberate, but now in positive ways. The reforms and awareness that emerged from her case had created lasting improvements in how institutions handled abuse and manipulation. The Pine Ridge Estates HOA had become a model for transparent governance. Their new policies required all board meetings to be recorded, all violation decisions to be reviewed by a community oversight committee, and all financial decisions to be subject to independent audit. Property values in the community actually increased after the reforms were implemented, as potential homeowners were attracted to an HOA with strong accountability measures and community involvement. Other homeowner associations throughout Connecticut began adopting similar transparency and oversight policies. The State Association of HOA Management Companies started requiring training on abuse prevention and fair enforcement practices. But the most significant change was in community awareness and response to elder abuse. The senior center where Grandma Eleanor spoke regularly had started a peer support program where elderly community members looked out for each other and shared resources about financial protection. Local banks had implemented additional protections for elderly customers, including red flag training for employees and protocols for situations where someone else was managing an elderly person's finances with power of attorney. The police department's elder abuse unit had investigated and prosecuted 6 additional cases in the 2 years following Victoria's conviction, recovering over $200,000 in stolen funds for elderly victims. The Victoria Mitchell case opened people's eyes to how sophisticated these schemes can be, Detective Martinez explained in a local newspaper interview. It showed that perpetrators can be respected community members with good reputations, and that families need to stay vigilant about protecting their elderly relatives. Meanwhile, our extended family had undergone its own transformation. Robert had served his sentence and was now working as a construction supervisor, having lost his real estate license permanently. He'd written letters of apology to all of Victoria's victims and was paying his portion of the restitution faithfully. I enabled her for years because it was easier than confronting her, he told me during one of our occasional conversations. I thought if I just went along with her schemes, she'd eventually run out of steam. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Their daughter had kept her job with the school district, but had been transferred to a position without access to confidential family information. She'd undergone extensive training on privacy and ethics and had become an advocate for stronger protections around student records. The son-in-law had found work with a different retail company and was rebuilding his career slowly. All of Victoria's immediate family had been required to attend counseling as part of their legal settlements, learning about manipulation, enabling behaviors, and healthy communication. Some family members had struggled more with recovery. A few relatives had remained loyal to Victoria throughout the legal proceedings, believing her claims that she was being unfairly persecuted. These relationships had become distant or ended entirely. Not everyone was ready to see the truth, my mother reflected. Some people were too invested in the image Victoria had created to accept evidence that contradicted it. This was another lesson from the experience. Recovery from family manipulation often involves difficult choices about which relationships to maintain, rebuild, or leave behind. Healing isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's about establishing boundaries and creating distance from people who refuse to acknowledge harmful behavior. Victoria herself had been released from prison after serving 14 months of her 18-month sentence, with time off for good behavior. She'd moved to Florida, where she'd gotten a job as a customer service representative for a timeshare company. Her professional licenses had been revoked, her community connections had been severed, and her reputation had been permanently destroyed. The woman who had spent decades building an image as a successful business owner and community leader was now starting over in a new state with a criminal record. I learned about her situation through court documents related to restitution payments, which continued to arrive monthly. Victoria was required to pay 25% of her income until the full amount was satisfied, plus interest and penalties. Occasionally, family members would share updates about her attempts to contact people or rebuild relationships. She'd written letters to some relatives, attempting to minimize her crimes or blame others for her downfall. The letters follow a predictable pattern, Janet Williams observed when I shared copies with her, minimizing responsibility, claiming victimhood, testing people's boundaries to see who might still be manipulated. These attempts at reconnection were part of what experts call hoovering, a manipulation tactic where abusers try to pull people back into toxic relationships after consequences have been imposed. Our family had developed strategies for handling these attempts. No direct responses to letters or contact attempts, sharing information about contact attempts with other family members, documentation of any threats or concerning content, consistent boundaries maintained by everyone. The most important lesson was that Victoria's conviction and imprisonment hadn't fundamentally changed her personality or methods. The legal consequences had limited her ability to harm people, but they hadn't eliminated her desire to manipulate and control. People like Victoria don't usually change, Detective Martinez had warned us. The criminal justice system can create accountability and provide protection, but it doesn't rehabilitate manipulative personalities. This understanding influenced how we approached family relationships going forward. We celebrated the justice that had been achieved and the healing that had occurred, but we remained vigilant about protecting ourselves from future manipulation attempts. The experience had taught us that recovery from abuse is an ongoing process, not a destination you reach and then maintain without effort. As I finish writing this account, 5 years after that Christmas dinner that started everything, I'm struck by how much growth and positive change emerged from such a destructive situation. Victoria's campaign against our family had been designed to isolate us, exhaust our resources, and force us into submission. Instead, it had strengthened our relationships, taught us valuable skills, and connected us to a broader community of people working to prevent abuse. The documentation system I'd developed out of necessity had become a resource used by investigators, attorneys, and victim advocates across the country. The family communication patterns we'd learned had created deeper, more honest relationships than we'd ever had before. The community reforms that emerged from our case had protected other elderly residents and improved oversight of institutional power. The awareness raised about manipulation tactics had helped other families recognize and respond to similar abuse. Most importantly, our story had demonstrated that even sophisticated, well-connected abusers can be held accountable when victims document carefully, work together, and use available resources strategically. For others facing similar situations, these are the key lessons I would share. Document everything. Start immediately, be systematic, and use multiple methods: photos, recordings, spreadsheets, timelines. Assume that everything might become evidence eventually. Build community support. Don't try to fight alone. Find other victims, connect with professionals, and create a network of people who understand what you're experiencing. Understand the systems. Learn about relevant laws, regulations, and institutions. Know your rights and the proper procedures for filing complaints and seeking help. Focus on patterns. Individual incidents can be dismissed or explained away, but patterns of behavior are harder to deny. Show how multiple tactics work together as part of a broader campaign. Protect yourself. Assume that abusers will escalate when challenged. Take steps to protect your safety, finances, reputation, and legal position before confronting manipulation directly. Be strategic. Choose your battles carefully, time your actions thoughtfully, and always have multiple backup plans. Manipulators are skilled at exploitation, so you need to be smarter and more prepared. Accept that some relationships may end. Not everyone will support you or accept evidence of abuse, especially when it involves a family member with a good reputation. Protect your mental health by setting boundaries with people who enable or excuse harmful behavior. Use available resources. Law enforcement, victim advocacy organizations, legal aid services, and regulatory agencies exist to help people in these situations. Don't assume you have to handle everything on your own. Plan for long-term recovery. Healing from manipulation and abuse takes time. Expect setbacks, celebrate small victories, and focus on building sustainable improvements rather than seeking perfect resolution. Help others when you can. Share your experience, resources, and lessons learned with other people facing similar challenges. Your knowledge and support can make a significant difference in someone else's ability to escape abuse. Victoria's story was ultimately about the abuse of power and trust within families and communities, but our family's story became about the possibility of healing, justice, and positive change emerging from even the most destructive circumstances. The Christmas dinner that started our war with Victoria had ended with her promising that our family would learn some respect. In the end, we did learn respect for ourselves, for truth, for healthy relationships, and for the importance of protecting vulnerable people from exploitations. We also learned that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up teaching you exactly how strong, capable, and resilient you really are. And that's a lesson worth $95,000 in restitution and 5 years of growth, healing, and positive change.